Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be joining you today, and I appreciate the invitation. It's wonderful to be hosted by the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, and I really appreciate all of the support that the museum offered to our students during the pandemic with online teaching and support for student projects. Today, I'm situated on traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoek peoples, on the northwestern edge of Treaty 2. In the 19th century, this region was also home to the Black abolitionists whose work we'll be talking about today. And it's important always, and really important in this moment on this day, to acknowledge that the histories of enslavement and the histories of Indigenous dispossession in Canada are both written on the landscape around me as I look out the window here. These are two interconnected aspects of empire and colonialism, and their long shadows still follow us. One further note before I get started with the discussion today. The subject of the talk, John James Edmonston Linton, was a Scottish immigrant, and while he called his anti-slavery paper the voice of the bondsman, Linton did not speak with the voice of a bondsman. In turn, I am approaching this study as a person who is racialized as white, and part of the interest in considering a white anti-slavery activist in the context of a larger research project on the Black press in Canada is not just to learn more about Linton, but to gain a new perspective on the Black press through following the traces that he's left us and through his experience. So I really want to know what we can learn about interracial activism, allyship in the 19th century, and what does reading Linton and the voice of the bondsman contribute to our understanding of the role of the Black press in Canada's abolitionist culture? I'll also note that the talk today is drawn from my section of a forthcoming co-written book chapter that I've worked on with two colleagues at Huron, both in the English and Cultural Studies department, Dr. Scott Schofield and Dr. Neil Brooks. The book is part of the Black Press in Canada project, which is a Shirk Insight grant that I work on with Dr. Bulu Ibande-Deberry from the University of Ottawa, the lead investigator, and Claudine Bonner at Acadia University. Our work has also been supported by Debbie Meert-Williston, the Special Collections Librarian at Western University's Archives and Regional Collections Center. So I mention all of this to give you a sense of the rich collaborative culture out of which this research project that I'm talking about today has emerged, and the ongoing work is really just made possible by those collaborations. Okay, so we can turn now to reading the voice of the bondsman, John James Edmonston Linton, and the Black press in Canada. And I want to start by recalling the abolitionist moment in 1857. What was happening in the Black abolitionist communities of Canada West, linked as they were to communities across the Great Lakes region and across the Atlantic world. I'll focus for a minute on the abolitionist lecturer Hezekiah Ford Douglas, or H. Ford Douglas, as he was known in his public life. Douglas, in 1857, Douglas had spent a grueling spring and early summer traveling across the American Midwest, through Canada from Detroit to Hamilton. The Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decision in March of that year, added to the almost incalculable burden on the abolitionist movement more generally, and on H. Ford Douglas, who was convinced that the American Constitution was irredeemable. So he felt the weight. And just making sure my slides are changing here. Oh, there we are. Okay. And as a member of the editorial team, a correspondent for Marianne Chadd's Provincial Freeman, Douglas reported on his travels, giving particular notice of his progress through Canada West, which was now becoming the repository of his remaining hopes for finding racial justice. Douglas's account was printed in the May 16th issue of the Provincial Freeman, which is, I've put an excerpt from this up on the slide. He writes, "We spoke to a crowded house in Stratford, and had the pleasure of seeing for the first time J.J.E. Linton, Esquire, who has won for himself a permanent and lasting reputation on both sides of the ocean by his untiring exertions to purify and cleanse the Canadian Church from the hateful contamination of slavery." In this praise that he's getting from H. Douglas in the Provincial Freeman, we meet John Linton, as the black press in Canada knew him, a Scots abolitionist, emigre, author, editor, publisher, and agent for his newspaper, The Voice of the Bondsman. Now, Linton produced 2 issues of The Voice of the Bondsman, which should pop up on the slides in a second. Both issues were taken up with Linton's urgent and impassioned call to, quote, "awaken up the people and the ministers of religion especially of Canada from a deadened lethargy on the evils of slavery." Every article in The Voice of the Bondsman is about churches, a condemnation of denominational ties, or what Linton called fellowshipping, with American enslavers and the institution of slavery, a condemnation of evangelical publishing houses who, he argued, were made complicit by their silence on the issue of slavery. So what at first appears to be this very narrowly focused argument, calling out Protestant denominations for their hypocrisy, reveals a much broader intellectual engagement with the politics of American slavery in the crises of the 1850s, and links John Linton to wider abolitionist print culture in Canada West and in the United States and in Scotland and in England and across the Atlantic world. So for the rest of the time today, I want to situate John Linton and the Voice of the Bondsman within abolitionist print culture, using research that's been made possible by the uncovering of a larger textual archive of material in Western University's collections, Linton's books and their annotations, material that helps us to reframe our understanding of abolitionist networks in Canada West and understand the reach of the black press in Canada. So we'll just think about Linton's biography for a few minutes. Linton was born on the Isle of Bute in 1805, but he spent most of his life before emigrating to Canada in the city of Greenock. And Greenock, in the time of John Linton, was one of the most active centers of trade in tobacco and sugar in the United Kingdom. During the 1820s, Greenock's links to slavery were visible everywhere, and the wealth that was pouring into the city's dockyards and refineries, that wealth was turning the houses of merchants and traders into broad terraces of prosperous stone. What's pictured here are the 19th century sugar sheds near the docks, recently proposed as a site for a museum in Greenock about Scotland and its links to the slave trade. In 1833, that was the year the Lintons emigrated, a single week's worth of trade in Greenock had netted over £29,000 in duties collected at the Greenock Customs House. But the news about emancipation was also in the air. As the Lintons made their preparations to leave Scotland, the Imperial Parliament was just grinding its way through the final debates on the Emancipation Bill that would bring the formal end to slavery in the British colonies, including Upper Canada. In this atmosphere, Linton may well have reflected on the possibilities of freedom, both personal and political, that framed his decision to leave Greenock just at that moment. Linton also exemplified a broader tendency within white Canadian and British anti-slavery culture to think about the empire as a site of emancipation, which is not the way we think about it today. There's little in his written work to really tell us what he thought about the past or the future of indigenous peoples whose dispossession underlay the narrative of Scots emigration to this region. By 1833, the Lintons joined an early wave in one of the largest concentrated efforts to recruit British immigrants in the history of settler colonialism in Canada. Indeed, Linton was so deeply invested in this identity as a settler in the, quote, wild lands, a persona that he worked out in his earliest publication, which he called The Life of the Backwoodsman. It described his experience and offered advice to prospective immigrants. He purchased land from the Canada Company near Stratford. He opened a school. He worked as a teacher. He served as the clerk of peace. And he farmed, and he published additional pamphlets on behalf of the Canada Company. So there's not really much here about Linton's early life in Canada, Upper Canada, to connect him to the cause of abolition, save for the fact that he was a founding member of the Presbyterian congregation in the village of Stratford and sided with most of his fellow congregants there in joining the Free Church of Scotland in the episode known as the Great Disruption of 1843. Now, the Free Church of Scotland's creation and its controversies coincided with the increased pace of activism on the part of abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass. And the Free Church of Scotland controversies really rocked the abolitionist movement across the Atlantic world. By seeking out and accepting support from American Presbyterian churches in slaveholding states, the Free Church of Scotland leaders had implicated the church in the sin of slavery. So for anti-slavery clergy in this new Free Church of Scotland, and for much of the laity, this fellowshipping controversy in Scotland was absolutely central to the way they sort of had to rethink their own identity as a church. As Frederick Douglass wrote, the fellowshipping controversy brought up the whole question of slavery and opened its way, he said, to full discussion. And during his speaking tour in Scotland in 1846, and you can see an excerpt from a map that traces this, as well as a photograph of the Gaelic church in Greenock where Frederick Douglass spoke. Frederick Douglass here laid bare the moral question at the heart of the Free Church controversy. I should find it impossible to draw a more graphic picture, he said, of the state of the churches in the United States than is drawn in these lines from the holy prophet Isaiah. In the single line, your hands are full of blood. We have the character of American churches aptly described. Their hands are full of blood, end quote. Douglass later devoted a chapter in My Bondage, My Freedom to the broader effects of this concentrated period of activism in Scotland that stood out to him for years after his return to the United States. He wrote that speech after speech, pamphlet after pamphlet, editorial after editorial, sermon after sermon, lashed the conscientious Scotch people into a perfect furor. Send back the money, was indignantly cried out from Greenock to Edinburgh and from Edinburgh to Aberdeen. End quote from Douglass. Well, that call to send back the money was certainly heard in Canada. Leading Free Church minister and a member of the Glasgow Emancipation Society, Michael Willis, was dispatched to Toronto in 1846 to try to help ground the emerging Free Church of Scotland congregations in Canada on the anti-slavery side, and to help ground the new Knox College in Toronto on the anti-slavery side of this Free Church rift. And by 1850, a large contingent of Free Church anti-slavery leaders, including Michael Willis, emigrated to Canada West, and Willis became president of the new Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. In 1851, at Willis's invitation, Frederick Douglass and other British abolitionists visited Toronto, and echoes of that free church debate rang through their speeches in St. Lawrence Hall, reverberating through North American anti-slavery circuits. They were amplified in the anti-slavery voice of the Toronto Globe and preached with fresh urgency in Presbyterian pulpits all across Canada West. So John Linton's anti-slavery consciousness was formed against this backdrop of the Free Church controversy, amid other things that were happening, right? The new pressures from the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law revitalized Free Church engagement in anti-slavery activism, the ongoing work of Black abolitionists whose voices were now reaching the, quote, backwoodsmen in Canada through the doors of the Free Church of Scotland meeting house in Stratford. Linton's first anti-slavery publication was an 1855 pamphlet titled The Slavery Question. It reprinted a New York Congregationalist Church's conference report on slavery and religious publication. And Linton's 7-page introduction related the report's findings to the Canadian church context. He had 1,000 copies of this report, The Slavery Question, printed at his own expense at the offices of the Globe in Toronto, and he distributed them to readers in every county across Canada West. He would send copies to the clerks of municipal governments across the region and ask for them to be distributed from there. The pamphlet set out the core argument that was repeated through every Linton anti-slavery publication thereafter. The argument that North American churches were guilty of fellowshipping with pro-slavery congregations and of allowing then pro-slavery assumptions and perspectives to seep in and to circulate through these nominally free states and into Canada by means of the religious literature that was being produced by evangelical publishing concerns, including the American Tract Society. So the problem he set out was that not just that there was a sin of being silent on the issue of slavery on the part of some churches in nominally free states, but that the sin of silence was being achieved through active censorship of religious texts that would, publishing houses who would remove sometimes the references to the evils of slavery and then reprint those works to be sold by agents of the American Tract Society and other publishers of religious materials. And so it's very clear that slavery no longer loomed for John Linton as a distant problem. It was brought home to Canadian clergy, taught in Canadian Sunday schools, preached to unknowing congregations. He also explained how he came to this subject. He said he had undertaken 12 months of research after seeing articles in the Toronto Globe and the Toronto Examiner that exposed the American Tract Society's plans to expand its system of distributing pamphlets and religious literature with a headquarters in Toronto. So he really saw this as a direct threat that was coming right to his doorstep. In a 19th century version of a social media takeover, Linton followed his pamphlet, The Slavery Question, with a special issue of the newspaper The Colonist in 1855. In 1856, he co-authored another pamphlet, Slavery in the Churches, Religious Societies, etc., with Thomas Henning of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. Linton wrote a string of articles that were printed in the Provincial Freeman in 1856 and 1857, and he wrote dozens of letters to editors of newspapers everywhere he could think to send them, from the Stratford Beacon to the New York Tribune to the London Advertiser. During this period, in 1856 and 1857, when he was most active in producing this material, he published 2 periodicals of his own. One was called The Challenge, and the other, the newspaper for which he's best known, of course, The Voice of the Bondsman. And the slide shows you the Provincial Freeman Extra from July 31st, 1856, in which he's taking material that he's worked up and sent around to all sorts of other places, and he's actually producing this as a special sort of edition of Mary Ann Shadd's Provincial Freeman. Right? So he's working in concert with her. So I'd like now to just hone in a little bit on the Voice of the Bondsman as a textual artifact. So let me change the slide there. And talk a little bit about how this came to, how Linton material sort of came to our attention afresh. During the spring of 2019, Huron's History Department was hosting students and faculty from Bath Spa University in the UK. It was part of a project, a teaching project called Phantoms of the Past. And as part of this research, we were looking at history and memory and how the history of enslavement was commemorated or forgotten or not commemorated, bulldozed away. And we'd organized a session at the at Western's Western's Rare Books collection in the reading room. My colleague in the English department, Scott Schofield, then managed to locate and then revealed for this gathered group of students and book historians that he'd found not only the first issue of Voice of the Bondsman, but the even rarer second issue. And you can see them here on the slide. They're set out on the table in the reading room as we gather around to sort of gasp at the find. The second issue, both of these were in the in Western's collection, but they had been largely forgotten since the first issue was microfilmed in the 1980s, so it was available in a kind of grainy microfilm copy. And many of you will have read about this rediscovery and the subsequent restoration of Voice of the Bondsman, and you can see it here. It was restored in London by a Book and Paper Conservation Services, and this was just a tremendous thing to have located both issues of this extraordinary paper. But just as exciting as the Voice of the Bondsman itself, you know, to see the original and then to have this access again to the second issue, and this constitutes the full run of the paper. This is it. Just as exciting was Scott's discovery of a number of books that had been owned by John James Linton, not just books that he signed with his name, which he did, but books that told us where he acquired them, when he acquired them, and absolutely told us what he thought of them, because he annotated them sometimes very heavily. And there are just extraordinary things in this material that are waiting to be examined further. For example, and the next slide will show you some of the books that were pulled out for this session, and the title page of Linton's copy of Frederick Douglass's My Bondage, My Freedom, which, so we not only have Linton's copy of Frederick Douglass's book, knowing the sort of context of the Douglass and the fellowshipping controversy in the Church of Scotland, but we also have Linton's copy of My Bondage, My Freedom, which contained an envelope with writing in Linton's hand, and postage with what appears to be a Rochester, New York postmark, which of course is where Frederick Douglass was living at that time, and Linton is sending sending the material back to himself, and you can see his address on the envelope, Stratford, Canada West, and it's just the material that that was associated with the books, the annotations and the bits pasted in, and other things that you find in the Linton materials is really interesting. So subsequent digging through the catalog and some serendipitous searching of the shelves in Western Library has turned up a small treasure trove of Linton's books. And we can really see that Linton's untiring exertions, as H.4 Douglass had said, in the anti-slavery cause have left this remarkable body of evidence about the Black press and its most active period in Canada West. So my colleagues have done a great deal of work with the Linton books, most of which were acquired at Western as part of the massive book collection that was donated to the university by another resident of 19th century Stratford, that is John Davis Barnett, whose collection formed the basis for Western's library, and whose collecting of anti-slavery works, including those of Linton, provided much of the foundation for the scholarship of the librarian who succeeded Barnett, which is, of course, Fred Landon. But I leave those possibilities about the Barnett collection to scholars who are more knowledgeable about book history than I am. I'd like to just think a little bit more about what Linton's books reveal for us about his relationship to the press, to the Black press. In the Western collection, we see correspondence with Mary Ann Shadd, notes about his actually having organized that speaking tour with H.4 Douglass in Stratford, copies of pro-slavery books that he owned and then that he really tore apart with his counter-arguments written in very impassioned annotations, anti-slavery books that he passed along to his neighbors in Stratford and St. Mary, saying, circulate. He would just write it in, circulate this. And all sorts of related material. That helps us to trace Linton's movement through networks that were created and sustained by the Black press in Canada and abolitionist print culture. Print is everywhere in Voice of the Bondsman and everything that he wrote. Much of the paper is taken up with printed lists of books, of other newspapers, lists of pamphlets on slavery, lists of denominational periodicals that he condemned, excerpts from newspapers that he recommended. So when we read it in this context, the Voice of the Bondsman comes into focus as a compilation of articles and letters that he sent out to all sorts of other places. And we can piece this together and start to trace some of what he described as thousands of letters sent across the Atlantic world to anti-slavery correspondents and editors. And this becomes then a very compelling narrative of an anti-slavery ally whose voice is reaching well beyond these densely composed pages of the Voice of the Bondsman. He's connected to the American Missionary Association, to the Bristol and Clifton Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, to anti-slavery Baptists in Britain, to the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society. He's writing to everyone he can think of. And moreover, he has this self-reflexive publication or habit of publishing text, of writing about writing, of publishing texts about texts, pamphlets about pamphlets, newspapers about other newspapers. And this draws particular notice of Black abolitionist editors, including the ones we've already mentioned, Mary Ann Shadd, H.4 Douglass, and Frederick Douglass, all of whom recognized that Linton's work is not just about conveying the urgency of the anti-slavery cause through a newspaper, but rather that Linton's work is imagining textual production and readership as a site of activism, that he's really calling on his readers to join him. He's expecting something to happen from all of this. Print for him was infused with a moral valence that rendered silence or censorship really dangerous, and he's highlighting the power of print when it's used for good purpose. Now, on the slide that I've popped up here, we see a quotation from an excerpt from Frederick Douglass' paper in 1856, talking about one of Linton's pamphlets. And he actually says, we notice this pamphlet less to commend it for the facts that it contains have been established in all sorts of forms. But more, we notice it more to commend Mr. Linton for his intelligent and indefatigable labors in the cause of emancipation. His object is to bring the moral and religious influence of Canada to bear point blank against slavery. This is a noble work, and it is nobly pursued by Mr. Linton. Similarly, the relationship between Mary Ann Shadd and Linton was distinguished by her regard for Linton's vision of the printed page as a space for uncompromising protest. No other white abolitionist's work was reprinted to the extent that Linton's was in the Provincial Freeman. Linton alone was welcome to write that special extra of Shadd's paper, subsuming for that moment the voice of the Bondsman entirely under the masthead of the Provincial Freeman. While some of his abolitionist friends, maybe his fellow Presbyterians in Canada, wished that their denomination had been exempt from his critical gaze and distanced themselves from Linton, Black abolitionists, and especially Black abolitionists who were involved in the Black press, seemed to find in him this kind of shared understanding of resistance in print. Mary Ann Shadd named her second child, her son born in 1860, Linton Shadd Carey. There's no way to confirm that Linton Shadd Carey was named for John Linton, but it is an intriguing possibility. It's plausible in keeping with naming practices among Black abolitionists who honored other activists in the names that they chose for their children. So that's an interesting possibility to ponder. In the opening article of the first issue of Voice of the Bondsman, Linton evoked a biblical image when describing his own work, and he talked about an image drawn from the book of Genesis, and the image was that of translates to witness heap, the term Yegar Sahadutha. And Yegar Sahadutha, a witness heap or a cairn, a pile of stones gathered up as a place of witness, a heap of testimony. In situating his work, or drawing attention to his work, calling it a Yegar Sahadutha, he was placing himself in a biblical landscape of memory and covenant, and it's also an intertextual reference to Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Dread, which was published in 1856. And in a pivotal chapter in that work, the chapter is titled Yegar Sahadutha, the title character of Dread builds a mound of moss and bark and stones in the swamp to memorialize those who had died in the violence of enslavement and to inspire his followers to armed resistance against their enslavers. So in adopting this image, Linton wrote that the facts he was presenting in that first issue of Voice of the Bondsman, in its compiled lists of periodicals and books, in letters that he printed and reprinted in the anti-slavery press, he says these works, these lists of materials, these shall, quote, shall be our witnesses, our Yegar Sahadutha. Abolitionist newspapers, pamphlets, books as memory and witness, set before readers in a kind of layered architecture of print and reprinting and cross-reference. He constructs the writing, publishing, distributing of the Voice of the Bondsman as a radical act of witness. And I think that he, through this, he draws on biblical and anti-slavery meanings to invite his readers to reflect on how the paper that they're holding in their hands is a site of activism and a site of memory. The historian Gordon Fraser talks about the emancipatory cosmology of the Black press, in which he argues that 19th century editors and readers and authors kept an eye on the celestial, the political, and the textual all at once, and anticipated a righting of wrongs. And I think that Linton fits within that cosmology. I think he understood something of that, of the Black press as a site of vibrant intellectual activism in ways that other white abolitionists sometimes did not. Okay. Well, Linton has drawn very little attention in Canadian historiography more generally. Robin Wink's entry in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and a handful of pages on Linton in The Blacks in Canada both almost dismissed Linton. They spoke of him as being kind of quirky and ineffective. Who pays attention to a newspaper that only had 2 issues and disappeared? In Alan Stouffer's Light of Nature and the Law of God, there's a little more sympathetic treatment of Linton's ideas, and Stouffer is really clear about the importance of abolitionist voices like Linton's that remain on the periphery of studies of anti-slavery culture in Canada. The analysis of anti-slavery in Canada, he wrote, will not be complete until it has taken into account the work of independent abolitionists such as J.J.E. Linton. So by placing the context of Linton in the context of this larger research project about the Black press and Black textual production, we can read outward and read richness in what might otherwise appear to be just a fragmentary record of an isolated voice. Linton has become part of the work of the project. It redefines what we mean by the Black press, opens up new ways of thinking about material and evidence. So some of the work in the larger project has been about making things accessible, like a full run of The Dawn of Tomorrow, which is just an incredibly rich and detailed resource. But other parts of the project have been about reading phantom texts. Newspapers like The Voice of the Bondsman that survive in 1 or 2 issues that are known sometimes to us only in the references made to those papers in other texts. So when we consider the power of this analysis of what we can do, when we consider not just the fragmentary textual record, but the context, the archival context in which the surviving evidence of an anti-slavery life has been preserved, buried, and now unearthed, you can start to see how some of the methodology of the project sort of opens out into promise. Shards of evidence, starting with the only extant copy of a newspaper with a complete run of 2 issues. Those bits of evidence have the power to unsettle some of the familiar narratives that we have about anti-slavery culture in 19th century Canada West. Because in Linton's texts, we see glimpses of this vibrant and hyper-networked world of anti-slavery activism, abolitionist churches, of political conventions, vigilance committees, anti-slavery societies, schools, the Underground Railroad itself as an activist network. All of this, we see, was a world largely constituted in print. So Linton's Voice of the Bondsman, I would argue, contributes to this larger historiographical and sort of larger concerns of the Black Press Project, helping to demonstrate that the sources are there when we look for them. And it suggests that the Black press in Canada's wider implications for intellectual history emerge from the record in ways that we're just beginning to document. Okay, so I am happy to check the chat and see what's going on there, and I may just scroll back up. Oh, I see. So Irene, you're anticipating the Linton naming question, and I would be really interested to know that, and it's just I find it one of the most interesting things. And when I found there not a lot of surviving correspondence, but there is this fabulous letter in which Linton is writing to Marianne Shadd about bringing H. Ford Douglass to Stratford, and it just sort of, all the threads sort of came together in that moment. Right. Okay, another question. He did not refer to the voice of the fugitive as far as I can, as far as I've seen. And I'm not sure if that just has to do with his focus on the material that's being sort of cranked out in the moment, in which he just felt this incredible urgency, this kind of flurry of activity in 1856 and 57. But that's a really interesting question too. He was also a temperance advocate and connected with abolitionists on that ground as well. But no, I don't see explicit references to Voice of the Fugitive, except if you think about it, the name of the paper strikes me as a quite possibly an intertextual reference, that he is sort of claiming Voice of the Fugitive, Voice of the Bondsman now, to address people who are still enslaved. So I think that although he doesn't refer to it in that way, in terms of recommending articles or explicitly referring to it, the Voice of the Bondsman, I think, is a reference to the Voice of the Fugitive, a kind of putting himself in conversation with that newspaper. Okay, what are some of the newspapers he recommended for people to read in addition to Provincial Freeman and Douglass's paper? So some of them were British anti-slavery papers, and he wrote to the editor of those newspapers as well. He recommended he was big on Horace Greeley and recommended Horace Greeley's newspaper. He had a whole list of things that people ought not read, including things published by the Tract Society. And he was, yes, he had this a remarkable kind of sense of how all of these things were fitting together. And some of the annotations that, one of the ways that we find books, have found the books in Western's collection, for example, is to look at the ones that he mentioned and say, oh, I wonder if we have a copy of that in the archives, then chances are it was Linton's copy. And several times that has actually turned out to be the case. There's a copy of a book about the Wilmot Proviso and the war with Mexico that belonged to Linton, and which contains a letter, a David Wilmot autograph letter in the pages of the book that Linton or someone has put in there. So it's a really interesting, again, sort of intertextual references. He'll go back and write in the cover of one book a quotation from Greeley's paper, let's say, or from, he recommended Provincial Freeman recommended him, but really that sort of nexus of Douglass and Shadd and H. Ford Douglass all sort of were at the kind of forefront of his mind in 1856 and 57. The reason he hasn't been more recognized, right? Well, I think this is interesting. I think that for some people, the concentration, I mean, he really, for him, the main, it's not that he was presenting, he thought that anti-slavery arguments were very clear, but what he really wanted to convince people of was the way in which churches were complicit, and how Canadian churches were in a special danger. So I think that part of the fact that he always focused in on that, on those questions of denominational history and religious publication, and you have to sort of put the background together to follow the whole fellowshipping controversy to see what it is that he's talking about. And I think for Robin Winks, for instance, this was just, you know, a kind of narrow view of a broader question. For Linton, I don't think it was narrow, but I think he's been perceived that way. It's just having this one kind of one-trick pony. That's all he could talk about was fellowshipping in the churches. But I think it is interesting, and I wanted to absolutely acknowledge the Stouffer observation that these interesting voices that have been on the periphery of a larger narrative have a lot to tell us about what was happening at the center. So I think it largely has to do with his sort of denominational preoccupations. Oh, I'm just reading comment from Irene. Thank you. Yes, really appreciate that, Irene. And of course, Laureen is also a former student from the University of Windsor, which is one reason why it's so much fun to be doing this presentation at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. Okay. Just going to open this up a bit. There we go, since we don't need the slides any further. Okay. Well, I really appreciate all of the questions and the comments. Thank you. I really appreciate that too. And it's been really fun to think about this material. We haven't been able to get back into to see the Linton books in person for a while. Fortunately, before that period between the spring of 2019 and the start of the pandemic, we were over there all the time, sort of looking at new Linton material that turned up and taking photographs. And thank goodness, because it's just been really helpful to have that research material on hand. I think that there are many more insights about the work of John Linton that will come as we sort of get back to the research. But he's turning out to be one of those figures who has started to appear in sources when I'm looking at something else and suddenly Linton pops up. So it's always fun when that happens and you sort of know you're onto something. Okay. I think that, just check and make sure I'm not missing any questions. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this and to think about your questions. And if anyone knows the answer to the Linton Shad mystery, by all means, let me know. I think that's one of the most fascinating possibilities that we've come across. All right, thanks so much, and take care.